of introduction. My name's Yetter Chappell. I'm a philosopher at the University of Miami. If you're interested in my work, you can find some of it on my blog, Good Thoughts blog, where I write my sort of public philosophy. And I'm talking today about the train to Crazytown, sort of worry about effective altruism. So as some of you will know, 5 years ago in the 80,000 Hours podcast, Ajay Kotra described effective altruism as a train to Crazytown, with long-termists in particular staying on the train for longer than their near-termist colleagues. Okay. And earlier still, back in 2015, Scott Alexander wrote about the dilemma that either we shouldn't care about non-human animals at all, or else, if we should, it seems like it would imply that they would totally swamp every other moral concern we might have. There's just sort of no realistic chance that the balance of the precise weighting is exactly right to be at like just the point where we could do like roughly as much good by either donating to human-focused charities or to non-human-focused charities. It's just like that would be like too much of a convenient coincidence. So that seems like kind of a strange dilemma. His response at the time was to kind of just safe word out of that whole line of like abstract reasoning for the sake of his sanity. And I actually think that's a pretty good response. And my aim in this talk is to try to give it a more principled backing. To be like, this is the right instinct, but can we say more about why it's actually like a good principled response to these sorts of puzzles? Okay. As a first step, I want to highlight how important it is that people feel free not to act on their like explicit abstract beliefs. Okay, so it might not sound ideal, like where there are these pretty strong like anti-hypocrisy norms in a lot of society. It sounds bad if you say you ought to do something, but then you don't do it. But from teaching applied ethics, I actually think it's really important to like make room for this kind of like not acting on your beliefs, because the alternative is you get completely swamped by like motivated reasoning to believe whatever is convenient for you to actually do. So especially if I'm teaching topics like charitable giving or like meat eating, my undergraduate students just engage in the most transparently motivated reasoning on these topics. It's terrible. So I think one of the sort of first things for kind of opening up space to actually reason well is to just create space to not have to act on the implications. Just be like, okay, maybe I'm just not doing the right thing here. Yes.
Is it another way to say that? It's okay to be somewhat bad?
Yeah, I mean, somewhat. Right, there are degrees, right? Yeah, so it might not be perfect, but we can all recognize we're not perfect. And so like acknowledging room for that is, I think, important as a first step to being able to kind of reason freely. Okay. So my bet is that we'd actually make more progress, more moral progress as a society, if people felt more comfortable just saying something like, yeah, I don't do as much as I should in this domain. It's on my moral to-do list. And then make sure your moral to-do list is like sensibly ordered and prioritized. And that gives you a chance that like maybe the next thing you then get to might actually lead to you doing a lot more good than you otherwise would if your attention was instead focused on like rationalizing and defending just whatever you're already doing. So I think really important to be able to kind of recognize room for improvement and then prioritize amongst those many different ways in which we all could improve. Okay, so background principle for this whole talk, let your beliefs roam free. And if you don't like where they end up, just don't act on them. You don't have to. It's your prerogative. Now, I do think we should make serious efforts to try to be like intellectually honest and work out what is actually most plausibly true. And hopefully by doing that, we'll be able to identify some significant marginal improvements that we can make for others, make the world a better place at relatively low personal cost to ourselves, and so actually be willing to make some of these improvements. Okay, so hopping back onto the train of abstract reasoning then. Here are the two big worries. The first is swamping effects. This worry, like we saw Scott Alexander thinking about non-human animals, that it could just lead to the total neglect of human interests. If there's so many, in terms of the numbers, so many trillions more insects, for example, in the world. And the second big concern is worries about motivating like fanatical or extremist behavior, violence, crazy kind of stuff, and neglecting downside risks. So I take it those are sort of a couple of the big concerns that people have about like following abstract reasoning wherever it leads without any guardrails. So my thesis is that both of these worries can be successfully addressed by suitable application of the distinction between kind of ideal theory and advisable decision procedures for fallible agents. And we've already kind of seen one instance of that in the introduction of this talk already with the point about the anti-hypocrisy norms and how in some sense it would be ideal to do what you thought was best, but it's actually pretty important for practical reasons to leave space open for us to do less than that sometimes. Okay. So the remaining core challenge then is to work out what sort of guardrails would be suitable to introduce on how we put theory into practice that limit the downside risks without symmetrically capping the potential upside of rational reflection, which I do think is pretty important. So here's my foil. As many of you will know, there was a prominent long-termist who famously endorsed on Tyler Cohen's podcast Double or Nothing Existence Gambles. He said he'd accept a 49% chance of destroying the world for a 51% chance of doubling it in all the value that it contains. He later became even more notorious for gambling with customer deposits, and he rode the train all the way to federal prison. As a moral philosopher, I'm interested in the question of when it's helpful to be guided by abstract moral reasoning and when we should be more cautious, conservative, and guided by common sense. Now, if there's one thing that philosophers know, it's that human minds often struggle to identify the flaw in a chain of reasoning that's like superficially plausible. If we were committed to accepting any conclusion whose argument we couldn't logically refute in the moment, we would be easy dupes. We would be at the mercy of anyone who is like more analytically quick-minded than ourselves. So, it makes sense that, people would have as a sort of standing heuristic a kind of unwillingness to just follow the argument where it leads whenever they, in that moment, couldn't see the flaw in it. It would make them too vulnerable to manipulation. So we don't want to be easy dupes in that way. But if there's a second thing that we know, it's that historically, unreflective deference to socially conventional common sense has enabled moral disasters. You can list your favorites: the slavery, homophobia, factory farming nowadays. It would be an extraordinary coincidence, I think, if our generation were the first whose conventional wisdom was morally perfect. I think shouldn't think that that's the case. So we have two opposing failure modes to beware against and protect against here. There's the easy dupe on the one hand, who sort of is too swayed by abstract reasoning, and there's the conventional dogmatist on the other, who's too stuck in whatever sort of social conventions they're raised in and not able to sort of revise those starting beliefs in ways that they really should on the basis of abstract reasoning. And the challenge is, again, how to balance these. Okay. So I view effective altruism as basically applied moral philosophy. So whereas most social movements are pushing certain predefined interests or values, EA's cause neutrality and concern for the abstract good makes it open to an unusually wide, at least in theory, open to an unusually wide range of concrete goals. And the usual sort of first stop on the train, combining cosmopolitan moral concern with concern for real evidence of effectiveness, is, I think, pretty widely recognized as an improvement over ordinary vibes-based giving. But people worry a lot about taking the train further. They worry about the next stops, of continuing with moral optimization all the way beyond that. So it's one thing to prioritize the global poor over the local homeless. Quite another, people say, to prioritize shrimp welfare or digital mines or AI safety risks. Okay, and that's before we even get to the worries about like violent extremism or anything. So in this talk, I want to explore our options, as I said, for mitigating those potential downside risks of moral optimization and abstract reasoning without losing the valuable upsides of being able to kind of improve upon the conventional common sense. People are often tempted by all or nothing reasoning, kind of have to go to one extreme or the other, but I think there's a lot to be said for moderation and messy compromises. My route to this conclusion goes via recognizing our fallibility and really taking it seriously, shifting from ideal to non-ideal theory. The question of how best to do that gives us our first major choice point. Okay, so addressing moral uncertainty. If there are a lot of different moral theories out there, even some that are not really theories at all, but just kind of a mishmash of like views, and your credence is sort of distributed across many of them, you're not super confident in any one particular view of what should be done, what should you do in light of that? This is the puzzle of moral uncertainty. And I'm going to highlight two sort of primary options. There are others out there, but these are the two I'm going to focus on. So the first, and the one that's maybe most kind of orthodox within sort of academic philosophy circles, is maximizing expected choice-worthiness. So this is just like maximizing expected value, if you're familiar with this idea, except it's made more theory neutral. So rather than assuming that value is necessarily the only thing that matters, non-consequentialists will think that things other than value matter. So kind of generalize that to be whatever it is that you think matters fundamentally that should guide your actions, that influences an action being worth choosing. You can sort of quantify the significance, the strength of that reason, and then take an expectation over that based on the probability that you assign, the credence that you assign to that theory being true as applied to this case. Okay, so that's one of the approaches. And that involves a very kind of centralizing approach to your agency. You're weighing the possible stakes of your decisions of each option in proportion to the credibility of the theories that assign it high stakes. And then it can lead you to potentially going all in on whatever option yields the best prospect and expectation. So this aspect of potentially going all in on one option is what leads to the worries about swamping effects. So, even if there's only a small chance that shrimp are conscious and that they matter morally, if there's enough of them, the numbers could work out such that they nonetheless swamp humanity's interest and expectation. So those are the kinds of worries that people raise there. And I think, in a sense, that one thing I'm wanting to suggest is that an approach of going with expectations, maximizing expected choice worthiness, seems most promising for ideal agents if they're actually really well calibrated in what expectations, what credences they're giving to the different accounts. But for human beings, where we've got very little sense of how confident we should even be in our credences, a kind of meta confidence should probably be low. There's a big risk for any kind of decision procedure, which can lead to a kind of all-in approach like that one does. So I think that's pretty risky for fallible agents. So the alternative that I want to focus on is the one that's particularly famous in sort of practical sphere because it's promoted by coefficient giving, previously open philanthropy, of worldview diversification. And so when academics talk about this, they might talk about related ideas using terms like moral parliament or a bargaining approach to moral uncertainty, where the core idea is to have kind of different buckets of influence representing the different theories and letting each bucket or subagent kind of use those resources in the way that it sees fit. And so you're not going to have any one of them taking over the others. They're kind of independent, decentralized subagents. So what's nice about this approach, I think, is that it sort of decentralizes and devolves power and resources to this ensemble of agents representing the different philosophical worldviews, and it does so in proportion to their credibility, as you see it. By design, this prevents moral swamping. You're not going to get the sort of human focus bucket is not going to get stolen from the shrimp bucket. They're separate sort of buckets. So you can easily ensure that any credible worldview maintains some power and agency to improve the world by its lights. So I'm a big fan of this approach. I think it's the most promising solution I've come across so far for helping fallible, non-ideal agents, as we all are, to manage this kind of uncertainty. So not only does it avoid swamping worries, but it also avoids the opposite problem of conventional dogmatism, of neglecting novel moral disasters. We can have a subagent who looks out for the shrimp. We can have another who looks out for the long-term future, and yet another who focuses on the most robust and reliable ways to improve human welfare today. The resources that we assign to each can shift in proportion to how credible we find each subagent's underlying philosophical worldview, which may change over time as we come across new arguments. And I think someone who takes this process seriously and sort of undergoes it responsibly can feel pretty confident that they're going to do a lot of good for the world. Okay. They're not going to be sort of gratuitously overlooking some really high potential low-hanging fruit in the way that the sort of conventional dogmatist is potentially overlooking a lot of really promising cause areas. It's not to say that this approach is necessarily optimal. It's just that it's hard to be confident in what alternative would beat it. In particular, I don't necessarily want to discourage anyone who's more willing to personally go all in on a neglected high-impact cause area, whether it's shrimp welfare, long-termism, whatever, especially if you imagine what your ideal moral portfolio would be for all of society. You may well find that you're going all in on a particular neglected cause area is on present margins actually the best way for you to diversify society's moral portfolio and make up for others' neglect of that important area. But I do think that we shouldn't want society, collectively, to go all in on any one cause area, whether it's speculative long-termism, shrimp welfare, or whatever, even if it would seem to have higher expected value than diversification. I think we shouldn't be confident in that sort of calculation that would lead to that expectation. Okay. So several reasons why I'm sort of hesitant to endorse the kind of societal all-in of narrowing of cause areas. So one, as I mentioned, is just sort of distrust in the calculations, thinking we shouldn't be that confident in them. So it's helpful to have a kind of principled hedge against that risk of miscalculation, and I think the diversification approach sort of serves that goal. And And I think especially if you have a sort of default prior of thinking that there's going to be like diminishing marginal returns in most cases from concentrated funding, we should kind of expect that actually the correct calculation of the expectation shouldn't really support like putting it all in one basket. So if our calculation seems to have that implication, we should probably think we've gone wrong somewhere. Sort of just a like background expectation that I have. But so even if we think that expectational reasoning is objectively ideal in some sense, like maybe an ideal agent could do it, my suggestion is we shouldn't be confident that human brains are capable of doing it. We may need a more diverse portfolio than an ideal agent would. Now, some of my motivation here may just be a brute unwillingness to follow the train of argument to certain destinations if they seem too crazy intuitively. But even that may be given a principled backing to some extent, since gut intuitions might encode a lot of subconscious information that's difficult to capture and model explicitly. So again, this ultimately does come back to, I think, just kind of distrust in the calculations and how much weight we should give to them. I think we should take them on board to a non-zero extent. Again, really want to avoid the kind of conventional dogmatism of just like dismissing anything that seems strange or unusual as a cause area. We don't want to just enable potential moral disasters by being that dismissive. But I also think that a kind of blind 100% difference to calculations risks disasters of its own. So some kind of intermediate weighting, which is going to involve good judgment. It's not an algorithmic process. Strikes me as a much safer approach. All right, moving on to the second issue then of dealing with risks, downside risks especially. One thing I want to emphasize from the start here is that there's a very significant moral risks to conventional thinking, not just to hopping on the train of abstract reasoning. So the outright dismissal of unusual causes, shrimp welfare to existential risks, could potentially be really, really bad, right? Like given the scales involved, it's not just that neglecting these things could conceivably be morally disastrous, like if some kind of, very, very kind of unusual possibility or anything. I think more strongly than that, we should think that like given the stakes involved, we should in some sense regard them as like expectationally disastrous to do nothing about these various cause areas. So I think there's a really strong reason for like taking them seriously. And this point bears emphasizing because I find that people often move from the unfamiliarity of these cause areas to the conclusion that they must require some really weird, distinctive philosophical assumptions and commitments to justify supporting them at all. And I think that's just getting things completely backwards. It's actually the very opposite is true. Any suitably agnostic, sort of moderate view of the possibility space will entail that we do have very strong reasons to support these incredibly ultra-high stakes cause areas. There's so much potentially at stake there. That would be kind of very reckless to do nothing at all about it. So it's the dismissal that I think requires super niche views in order to really justify. Now, if you're pattern matching here to worries about Pascal's mugging, being mugged by minuscule probabilities, I do think it makes a big practical difference whether we actually have sufficiently good reasons to regard the speculative claims here as substantively credible. So the sorts of cause areas I'm talking about, I do think are like credible ones. It's not just sort of Pascalian probabilities, but other people could disagree. It's ultimately a judgment call. But the main thing I want to emphasize is that like made up numbers won't automatically qualify as sufficiently credible to influence your action. It does really require judgment. These judgment calls are answerable to evidence and argument, but certainly can't be settled by any algorithm I can offer you. A second thing to note is just that the sort of proportional representation approach of the sort of worldview diversification through those subagents, it caps the downside. So even if I shouldn't have given seats to one of these worldviews, it still only gets a pretty small share of the kind of overall influence from my resources, rather than swamping the whole portfolio as it might under a more sort of expectational approach. So I think you don't need to be sort of so worried about Pascalian worries if you go with a worldview diversification approach. Okay, so my claim is that the most sensible, moderate view gives neither 0 nor 100% of our collective moral resources to weird speculative causes. We should all want to see a more intermediate value, and hence think about how our marginal contributions could bring us, as a society, closer to that goal. So there's definitely a kind of speculative reasoning that I'm very open to and encouraging of. I think people in general should be more open to it. And this in particular is speculative reasoning that expands our options and protects against a wider range of potential moral disasters. I think that's the kind of speculative reasoning that we should be like, okay, this is sort of relatively safe and significant and important to be responsive to, and it would be risky to dismiss it. But there's a very different kind of speculative reasoning that I think should be like quarantined to the philosophy seminar room and never let out, right? And that's, roughly speaking, reasoning that has the tendency to narrow our options and leave us more vulnerable to downside risks and possible moral disasters. Classic examples include things like double or nothing existence gambles, wire-hitting people into experience machines, especially against their will, any kind of like violence or like social defection, whether that's stealing to give or like assassination. Like any of these things seems like just a really bad idea on its face. And they do all have that shared sort of tendency to like actually kind of, I think, narrow our potential in a way that's pretty dangerous. Okay. So it's a very familiar point in the utilitarian tradition that naive instrumentalist calculations in support of this kind of disreputable norm breaking for the greater good are apt to be unreliable. They're just not very reliable, trustworthy calculations. We should probably think that they more often will result from motivated reasoning or other kinds of mistakes rather than from objectively correct calculation. And since we can't tell from the inside whether we're one of the people who are mistaken or not, we simply can't trust the results of a convenient but usually misguided mode of thought like this. Once we take this into account, this fact about our own unreliability, we find that the higher order expected value of disreputable norm-breaking behavior is almost always negative. That's my view. I think a good test to ask is whether common sense would recognize one's situation as a legitimate exception to the usual rule or not. So, there are cases like lying to the murderer at the door, where everyone will agree, yeah, of course, that's a reasonable exception to the usual moral rule. So it's not like we should endorse absolutism. But the thought is that a kind of common sense can actually help guide us pretty well, I think, for kind of navigating some of these exceptions. It won't always be clear, but at least as a rough heuristic, it's like better than nothing. And again, there are a couple of reasons to quite like the common sense kind of test. I mean, one is just the point I made earlier about how common sense might encode some valuable heuristic information. The other more cynical reason is that common sense will shape how other people react to the norm breaking, and so the reputational costs of the action can be very significantly influenced by that. And that's something that I think is pretty important. Okay, so that practical endorsement of something like common sense moral constraints, although it's ultimately justified on pragmatic rather than intrinsic grounds, is how I think we can best address worries about extremist behavior in light of high-stakes beliefs. So this is another point that I want to dwell on for a moment, because I think public discourse around this is just kind of painfully stupid. So you see people on Twitter claiming that to call AI an existential risk constitutes incitement to violence against AI company CEOs. And I feel like these people are really telling on themselves if they're so bought into naive instrumentalism that they don't even notice the gap between recognizing high stakes and encouraging violence. I mean, it's crazy because it's undeniable that the world contains high stakes. I mean, in politics, for example. And it must be possible to recognize this truth without thereby supporting political assassination. You might ask, how is it possible? Well, this is where bad philosophers might appeal to deontology. They'll say we just have to reject consequentialism, and then there's no longer any temptation to take bad means to good ends. Now, I think that's a bad philosophical claim, because what they've done there is they've lost track of the fact that actually moderate deontology is a theory, and no one really endorses absolutism these days. Moderate deontology also mandates doing the best act when the stakes are sufficiently high. And that's precisely the kind of scenario that we're concerned with here. So deontology is actually no help at all. What we need is an epistemic claim rather than a moral one. We need people to believe that it would actually be counterproductive to do those kinds of norm-breaking acts, not that it would just be intrinsically immoral. Yes?
Sorry, just to comment on that, it seems to me that they're good with utilitarianism and consequentialism. If I assassinate someone because I don't like their political ideas, the likelihood of them returning the favor seems pretty high, and that is bad consequence.
Right. Yeah, so I think any sort of consequentialist view is going to say, so a utilitarian one is just one that has as its account of what the good is to maximize human well-being. But even whether you're a specifically utilitarian consequentialist or any other one, I think you want to take into account the risks of like unintended bad side effects from engaging in violence. And yeah, it's going to be pretty significant. All right. So yeah, like I said, what we really need is for people to reject naive instrumentalism, to think that like whenever something seems to them superficially like it would promote a goal, to just assume that it really will, even if it's like violating all these background norms. We should be a bit more differential to some of that sort of background, those background social constraints. And come to instead sincerely believe that taking the bad means would be counterproductive to good ends. And again, that's ultimately an empirical belief, but like favoring liberal democracy over dictatorship, it's one that I think we clearly ought to hold as a matter of very robust expectation. Even if there are like possible worlds where like the opposite would work out better, there are possible exceptions. We shouldn't expect to be able to reliably identify them in advance. Okay, so we should have a very strong commitment, I think, to those sorts of norms that are generally going to be more reliably good. All right, so to wrap up, that's my response to extremism. We reject naive instrumentalism. We saw that my response to swamping concerns was to appeal to worldview diversification rather than maximizing expected choiceworthiness as our method for dealing with moral uncertainty. Both of these practical fixes, I think, are mandated by the realization that we can't be trusted to reason perfectly. And they're fixes that I hope serve as kind of asymmetric guardrails. They limit the downside risk quite a lot without symmetrically capping the upside by quite so drastic an amount. When we combine these two solutions, I think there's just no longer anything to fear from the train to Crazytown. In fact, it's a mistake to think that we have to choose a single destination along the route at all. Instead, I think we collectively ought to diversify and ensure that every credible philosophical worldview gets to exert proportionate power and influence in shaping the world for the better. And rather than being, as Scott Alexander feared, a series of unprincipled exceptions, I actually think we can reasonably view this stance as kind of meta-optimal, taking higher-order uncertainty into account, despite the fact that no first-order worldview would identify the resulting compromise as optimal on first-order grounds. Now, one interesting theoretical upshot of all this is that it turns out that actually our moral theories have a slightly different role in our moral life than you might have expected. Rather than their role being to directly guide us as moral agents, it's rather to do something more like to guide our sub-agents, those sort of different buckets of sort of worldviews that we defer to. We have this ensemble of sub-agents, and each of them will be guided by a moral theory. But we, as a sort of collective agent, have to take all of those into account and not just be guided by any one theory. So I think that's kind of an interesting result. This way of structuring the connection between theory and practice has a helpful tendency towards moderation, and I think towards reaping the low-hanging fruit of abstract reasoning while limiting the downside risks. So those are my thoughts. I look forward to hearing yours. Thank you.
There's a heuristic that I find pretty useful that I think Holden Karnofsky developed, which is sequence thinking versus cluster thinking. I don't know if you've come across this, but basically sequence thinking is the idea of like a really long chain of reasoning where if you believe every step along the way, then you can be like very confident that the conclusion is definitely true. Yeah. But if there's any mistake along the way, then it all kind of falls apart. And cluster thinking being like, many weak arguments pointing in a certain direction. So if any single one of them fails, you've still kind of overall got a sense of where they're pointing. Curious how this, if this fits into your thinking at all, and how.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. So I do think it sort of ties into this idea that we should prefer kind of modes of thinking that are going to be kind of quite robust. So, you know, I had the heuristic of like giving us more options, broadening our option space, protecting against a wider range of disasters. And this may be just sort of one instantiation of the more general point that you're pointing to of trying to be kind of robust against a wide range of sort of possible error modes. And so, yeah, with a sort of sequence approach, if there's just a chain of reasoning and the weakest link is going to get you into trouble, then it's much more fragile than, yeah, when you've got a whole cluster of supporting reasons that you're not so dependent on any one of them. And yeah, I think that's really important for practical reasoning.
I'm curious about how you would respond to the accusation that effective altruism is a kind of house style for, supporting capitalist kind of, extraction. Essentially, working as courtiers for capitalists. What I mean by that is I don't see effective altruists ever analyzing the structural kind of exploitation built into this structure of capitalism. And, it's interesting, like, that AI emerges just as programmers, engineers in Silicon Valley start developing class consciousness in the mid, teens, and unionizing, right? Because automation historically, I mean, AI is nothing new in terms of automation. Historically, responds and is a capitalist response to worker organization, right?
Yeah, good. So this is a common objection that I get from sort of, especially my academic colleagues who worry a lot that effective altruism is sort of too friendly to capitalism, insufficiently kind of left wing compared to their preferred politics, and I think it's just a sincere disagreement about economics and politics and what would make the world better. So I mean, when I read some of the more sort of socialist leaning critiques, I mean, I just worry that the policies they would favor might actually make the world worse. I quite like capitalism. I think it's done a lot to make the world better. But, those are just substantive disagreements that people can have. I don't think any of that's built into the ideas of effective altruism, though it is kind of interesting sociologically that, like, quite a lot of the sort of philosophers and people who are drawn to effective altruism do tend to be maybe a little bit more sort of centrist compared to their socialist critics. I don't really know why more socialists haven't gotten into effective altruism, especially of the sort of original variety that was, very focused on the global poor. I think it's a bit of a mystery why that didn't manage to resonate more with them. I mean, I don't think asking wealthy people to give away their money is like an obviously like kowtowing to the capitalists kind of move.
So, being European, we don't really do charity. And so one of the reasons is we would think that it's the state's job to actually look after the poor, not the rich.
Yeah, but it's not doing the job very well, is it? Especially globally.
Well, fair enough as a critique, but that's the reasoning.
So I worry that for my internal long-termist sub-agent, that its first order of business is going to be to kill off all my other sub-agents and take their resources for the sake of the long-term future, which maybe sounds silly, but I mean, you also mentioned coefficient giving as an organization that has this philosophy, and I think it seems plausible. Maybe their AI teams probably want more influence and power over the organization to direct the resources of it all. Do you have any thoughts on how to correct for that, or whether or not that's actually a thing to correct for?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a tricky issue. I mean, I think you do want there to be the potential to revise your initial assumptions about what the breakdown should be. So you want the sort of representatives of the different sort of views to be able to make their case for getting more of the resources. I think it just has to be, you want the agent to be sort of deciding between them based on, rational assessment of the credibility of their case rather than any kind of like underhanded politicking or something. How to make that work in reality, I don't know. I guess maybe ask a political scientist or someone, but philosophically my answer is like, try to determine it rationally. That would be nice.
I very much like the analysis, but I'd like to probe the issue of common sense in Crazytown with a possible example where framing seems to be part of the issue. So imagine a scenario where you have two planets, Earth, one other, both with 8 billion people, and God offers you the choice of your planet, Earth, being safe, the other one destroyed 100% certainty, or 51% chance both are safe. It seems like, in a sense, that's equivalent to the other one you cited, but with that kind of framing, where the other planet already exists, it seems different intuitively. Do you know what I mean? So do you worry that sometimes the framing makes things look worse or better than they are?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really hard to know how to deal with framing effects because it definitely seems like you can find ways of reframing tricky seeming sort of thought experiments, sometimes a little bit differently, but in a way that you might think shouldn't make that much difference, and yet it can lead to an intuitively very different answer. In your case, one thing that I think is sort of substantively importantly different is that the beings already exist on both planets. And so there are some views where philosophically we ought to give like more weight to existing beings than to merely possible or sort of possible future ones. And so, you know, killing someone or failing to save someone's life is worse, it's a bigger deal than like merely refraining from having an extra child, right? Like you could have brought another person into existence, but like if you see a child like drowning in a pond, you know, Peter Singer's famous case, if you imagine like walking past and being like, oh, it's no big deal, I'll just have an extra kid to make up for it, doesn't seem like that makes up for it. So like there's a difference between letting die and creating, even though they both lead to, in some sense, the same number of total lives at the end of the day. So I think that's sort of one intuitive factor that's quite different there. But it is an interesting question. Yeah, if we do have that case where both planets already exist, what would actually be the right answer there? And I do think my approach of sort of trying to avoid the worst case scenarios to some extent and keeping options open would probably lead towards the safer option of ensuring that at least one planet survives. Might even do it if the option was not our planet, but the other one, which I imagine more people would be uncomfortable with. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Thank you.
The British statistician George Box has this famous quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So do you think that it applies to moral theories as well? And like, what would be the consequences?
Yeah, so I actually think that a moral theory could be true, but it's very hard to know which one. So like we shouldn't be super confident in them. So it could be that for practical purposes, treating them as something more like models is a good way to go. I guess speaking as a philosopher, like when I'm doing my philosophical writing, I wouldn't want to like endorse that as the literal truth of the matter is that it's merely a model and we've got like no possible grasp of the underlying reality. I think we should try to work out what really is the true moral theory. But yeah, because of our recognized fallibility and stuff, we shouldn't go all in on any one theory. We should have that sort of wider, sort of treating them more as models. I think that's a nice approach.
How much do you think the path to Crazytown is paved by moral discoveries, and how much is it paved by crazy empirical discoveries? So, like in the case of insects swamping human and vertebrate welfare, I'm not sure that the moral claim there is so crazy at all.
Yeah.
What's crazy is how many insects there are, this empirical fact that most of us are unaware of. Or again, people will sometimes talk about moral uncertainty in large universes being, moral trade, acausal trade in large universes being maybe the most important cause area. Again, I don't think that the decision theory is so crazy. What's crazy is that we might live in an infinite universe, and that's what drives this pretty radical conclusion.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I used moral uncertainty for purposes of sort of familiarity, that's the way it's talked about in the literature, but in a way, a much broader sort of philosophical uncertainty or like worldview uncertainty is sometimes the more significant thing. Particularly, so one thing that comes up there is a little different from what you're getting at, but something that's worth flagging is that I think a big question that people have that is driving some of this uncertainty is questions about like, how sentient are tiny creatures, you know, shrimp or other insects, like, do they experience suffering? If so, like how severely, like how much is there? That's not a moral question. That's a question about the world descriptively, but it's still kind of philosophical. It's not like we can easily just do like a scientific study and get the answer like straightforwardly. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. There's some sort of broadly empirical uncertainty. But then as you flagged, with a lot of, if we were able to assume that they're like definitely conscious to at least some extent and suffer, even given that, it might still seem strange in some sense to have the result that would swamp humanity. But the reason for the strangeness might just be that we had never previously reflected on how many insects there are. And so it's just that sort of descriptive fact about the sheer numbers is like kind of shocking and unprecedented in how we've been thinking about and like implicitly modeling the world. It's like we have to update our models. It's like a really like, that's a difficult, like counterintuitive thing. But yeah, there's a question of, yeah, how much is it really the moral updating as opposed to just the descriptive? I suspect a lot of people are going to want to have the conclusion fairly fixed that we shouldn't neglect humanity. And so if they discover the empirical fact that there are, you know, trillions of insects that might be suffering or something, then in order to preserve the conclusion that nothing can swamp humanity, they might want to adjust their moral theory to say, well, okay, actually, insects just don't matter morally, even if they suffer. So I worry about that sort of motivated reasoning, and that's one reason why I want to sort of preserve space for moral uncertainty, where even if they want to go that way to some extent with some of their subagents, I'm going to want to insist, make sure you at least leave some space for caring about them as well, and that'll help avoid the like worst disasters. Yeah.
I just wanted to read this quote from Scott Alexander that seems relevant, and I quite like it, which is, if I can't find any system of axioms that doesn't do something terrible when extended to infinity, I will just refuse to extend things to infinity. I can always just keep world A with its 5 billion extremely happy people. I like that one. When the friendly AI asks me if I want to switch from world A to something superficially better, I can ask it, tell me the truth, is this eventually going to result in my eyes being pecked out by seagulls? And if it answers yes, I have a series of 28 switches, and each one is obviously better than the one before, and the 28th is this world, except your eyes are getting pecked out by seagulls, I will just avoid the first switch.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's very nice as a sort of practical response. I mean, unsatisfying philosophically, because we really want to work out like what's actually the best way to think about these things, and so that does require extra work beyond just dismissing it. But if you're faced with the actual decision of like which world to instantiate, yeah, maybe don't go flicking those switches quite yet.
Can you explain why your approach is more principled than Scott's? It seems like you said like you have subagents and you assign some number to them, but like yeah, it still seems like not equally unprincipled, but like similarly like vague.
Yeah, so there's definitely vagueness. So no question that there's a lot of like imprecision and sort of stuff that is left for the audience member to kind of fill in their own details. So I'm not giving you an algorithm or anything like that. So it's not principled in the sense of being like totally determinate how to do it. So the thing that I'm trying to add is, rather than anything super precise, what I'm trying to add is something more like an explanation of why this is a good approach. So, you know, what I got from Scott Alexander's 2015 post about the series of unprincipled exceptions was like the verdict, namely, just don't go in for that kind of crazy abstract reasoning if it goes too far. And I like that verdict. But he didn't really have too much other than like, I want to preserve my sanity as like the defense for it. And like, that's a good stuff for a defense, but I'm trying to be able to offer a bit more in support of it. So the hope was that by appealing to the advantages of worldview diversification over expectational approaches to moral and philosophical uncertainty, that can kind of help give us like more of a sense that like there's actually like a good backing for doing something in this vicinity, even if it's still left a little bit vague exactly what the something is.
I don't really get how you account for moral error using a parliamentary approach to morality. So for example, let's say like most of my subagents don't think that Claude is conscious right now, but maybe one or two do. And they would be like, hey, you're killing 100 instances of Claude a day. Like maybe I should just update and be like, maybe I need to treat Claude politely at least, but I don't see how those converge.
Yeah, so there's going to be a question of what you can actually do that will serve the goals of your subagents. And that'll differ depending on the particular case. So in some cases, I mean, in a sense, the most kind of all-purpose kind of general thing that you can do for a goal is like try to find people who are working on it and like send them money so that they could do more work on it. So, you know, maybe you could donate to like digital welfare kind of charity or something. So yeah, there's this. I don't know for sure what the best option is. Like, it would be kind of up to the subagent to do the research work to figure out, okay, what do you want done with this portion of my resources that I'm allocating to you? Tell me what to do with them. It's up to the subagent. Yeah, I can't necessarily say what the most useful answer would be.
So here are two ways of having the buckets or subagents. One is I apply like a discount rate to the things that go in there that are proportionate to my kind of meta uncertainty or weirdness, right? But then you still could potentially be swamped if it got large enough. The other is I have the bucket and it's got like a cap, and I'm just like, I commit to, and that's good that you can never be swamped, but then it's also like you can never revise the size of the bucket either if you kind of get more, if the numbers get large enough. So yeah, I just wonder if you could say a bit more about which of those approaches you're envisioning, and maybe also, is it, what do you think about the idea that in practice people just have like one weird bucket and everything that's weird goes in there, and then they have the others?
Yeah, so I think we might want multiple weird buckets. I wouldn't necessarily want to limit it to just one. But my background sort of thought was that the buckets were just sort of proportionate to your credence in that worldview. And so the thought is that avoids swamping because it's just set by a particular size. And as long as you've got some credence in the other ones, they're not going to get taken by that one. Does that help? Was there a sense in which you were thinking that you would get sort of swamping or something even on a credence proportionate approach to allocating the buckets?
Sorry. The bucket's proportionate, but I guess I'm considering where the case where you get the numbers going up, and so it's going to like overflow the bucket or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Does the bucket get bigger to accommodate that? So you've got a cap.
Yeah. It's just got that number of resources that were put into that budget, and it can use those resources in whatever ways it thinks are best.
And you're not going to revise your budget.
I mean, not unless you become convinced that actually that worldview deserves more credence than you previously thought, and then you could revise it. And presumably, maybe the budget will refresh every wee while or whatever. But yeah, it avoids swamping that way.
Yeah, so just asking the same question because maybe some of us are confused. So suppose your credence of this worldview is 1%, but if it's true, then it's like infinite amount of stuff. Then you get back to like the original issue where you may want to say, okay, I want to give because even though I think this view of the world is not very credible, if it's true, there's a huge impact. And so...
Yeah, no, it only gets 1% of your resources. So yeah, it definitely means that you're really strictly limiting sort of how much swamping is possible to happen here. And so you might think that's a pretty significant downside to it if you're like, oh no, I mean, given the expectations here, I'm really letting a lot of expected value go by not putting more of my resources into this like really high potential bucket. When I've got all these other buckets, so much like, it really doesn't matter very much what happens in the world. And yet I'm putting like half my resources into this. Like, isn't that crazy? So it's at least a downside. I agree that there's something a little bit like costly there. And so there's an interesting question whether it would improve the kind of general approach to try to build in a little bit more stakes sensitivity than what I've got. So, as a first pass, the sort of simple bucket approach really addresses the swamping worry. And I think that's nice. That's something I was wanting to achieve. But maybe there's a way to like balance it a little more where you don't get swamping, but you do get a little bit more stake sensitivity to some extent. I don't know. It'd be interesting to think about what the right balance is there. All right. Thank you.